My name is Deborah Boucoyannis. I teach comparative politics at George Washington University, and I'm here to present my talk today entitled No Such Thing as State Formation, the Paradox of State Origins. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I can't think of a better audience to present an argument like this. There's so many people in the audience who can speak very expertly about these issues. This is a very, my first draft, in fact, but work in progress, so I very much look forward to getting your feedback. The project is entitled No Such Thing as State Formation, the Paradox of State Origins. And what I will argue today is that early state formation was in fact regime formation, and the distinction that exists in the literature is actually a little misleading because it directs us away from the need to acknowledge the juridical character of the state, especially in its early stages, but also beyond. And let me just say a few things about what I mean here. First of all, I'm going to present you evidence that shows that in the pre-modern period, the concept of the state referred to the governed community, right? The current definition of the state is really a 19th century invention. But this isn't a simple terminological difference, right? It's not that people just use the term differently in the past. It's that this is actually reflective of a very different understanding of how the process of both state and regime formation actually proceeded. So what we're going to see is that the process that actually produced what we consider the state, armies, courts, taxes, depended on the process that produced the regime, which we typically associate with parliaments and other assemblies. Now, in fact, courts and parliaments really often cannot be distinguished in this period, right? Now, the result of this sort of misconception in the field is that existing studies do not adequately measure the concept. The empirical indicators for the state must include, I argue, juridical variables, things like courts, rights, legal systems, which are almost entirely absent from the state-building literature. The main reason why we want to sort of acknowledge this is because it turns out that the effects that are commonly attributed to war are, I will argue, endogenous to juridical institutions. And the reason why this has been misconceived is because continental Europe has provided the models for how we understand state building, and that is, I would argue, not the best model to have when you're trying to explain how effective states are actually built. Now, the way the presentation is going to advance is I'm going to make the points about the state being conceived as community. Then we're going to look at the mechanics of historical state formation. I'm going to pose a few brief questions about why Germany has really loomed so large in the social scientific imagination and really shaped the way we approach especially state formation. This will lead me to ask the question, okay, what is the dependent variable we're really interested in? And I will conclude by offering a suggestion. This is really a preliminary sort of attempt to offer a definition of the state that really takes into account the implications of the historical record. So let's start with the state as community. Now, I remember reading that stuff a long time ago when I was a graduate student, and it hadn't really even sort of become clear until I went back to look at the historiography of the concept, just how systematic the evidence is. There's not even really much of a debate, right? Across political ideologies, you find the idea of the state being used to refer to the community. So you might expect that with defenders of popular sovereignty. So Switzerland, Botero called Switzerland a state popular, right, subject to no prince. So it was used to describe the body of the people who retain sovereignty over their community versus monarchies and principalities, right? So you might expect that. But the same thing is found in defenders of both absolutism and divine right, right? The state there is defined as the union of the people under the same sovereignty of government. That's Baudin, right? Even Thomas Hobbes, who comes along to criticize all these three and to present social contract theory, identifies the commonwealth with the state, and it's based on the consent of individual subjects, right? The monarch being merely a representative, right? Now, the realists here might say, oh, well, you know, Machiavelli is going to come to the rescue, but open The Prince, the first sentence reads, all states are either republics or principalities, right? So the state is the genus and regime is the species, right? So the modern conception of the state really comes from the 19th century, unsurprisingly, and there's some very important work that gets carried out there with people by von Kirche, Maitland, T.H. Green, who conceive of the state as a kind of a corporate legal entity, right? And this is, of course, central in sort of shaping the views of the German and Austrian scholars who shape our thinking, people like Hintze, Weber, and Schumpeter. And this sort of debate has kind of extended into 20th century pluralism and the debate with the statists that has really set the terms for the current debate on the state, or the current approaches on the state. So just to give some definitions, and in the paper there's a little bit of slippage because I consider courts to be part of regime, so I just want to make clear here at least some conventional definitions. There's an infinite variety. I've got a database of dozens of definitions. I'm here presenting just the ones that I think are simplest and most effective. So classic Scotch-Poll, 1979, the state is identified with administrative, policing, and military organizations, right? So armies, courts, taxes. Regime, I choose Fishman not just because he's from Notre Dame, but because he's got the definition that I think is least dependent on an understanding of democracy, and it's kind of the most comprehensive that I have found. And he defines a regime as a formal and informal organization of the center of political power and of its relations to the broader society. I think that does a very good job of capturing both the modern and the pre-modern understandings of regime. So let's look at what the historical record tells us that shows that this isn't simply, okay, people in the pre-modern period use the word of the state differently, or they didn't have a conception of the state. That is really not a profoundly interesting topic unless you're a political theorist. But for an empirical analysis, the implications are important. And let me just make very clear, because we have some China experts here and probably many more people rightfully looking at other parts of the world. This is an argument that has very definite scope conditions in its current form, right? The locale is Western Europe and the period is pre-modern, especially medieval. How this applies beyond is a subject for further research. But let's try and get this story at least as more accurate as we can. So the claims here is it's impossible to distinguish between regime and state formation in the period of origins. Medieval rulers didn't set out to create a state, right? They set out to create a kingdom, a principality, a dukedom, an empire, or an urban republic if it was a collectivity. The state, in fact, is an emergent property, right, of this process, which later theorists came to synthesize in the way that we are familiar. And perhaps the best way to sort of understand what is going on here and what the causal primacy is to situate this argument against its main sort of interlocutor, which is the bellicist argument, that tells us that both states and regimes are endogenous to war, right? Classic Tilly. Now, the arguments here, and of course they've been greatly modified, qualified, but the sort of pure classic version is state formation starts after 1500 with the military pressures that come from the military revolution for larger numbers of infantry, with the result of large territorial states emerging. Now, there's a specific sequence that is posited here that's pretty consistent across people using this, scholars using this theoretical perspective, which is that extraction and protection comes first, and then you get the other services, right? So Parliament is exchanged, after the rulers need to collect more revenue in order to expand. Adjudication, and Tilly is one of the very few actually who even mentions adjudication, right? Most people don't even sort of discuss it. But he calls it a risky endeavor, doesn't really explain. At least in the 1992 book, he's written so much, I don't want to claim that this is his final word, but at least in the classic 1992 book, he calls it a risky endeavor that, that was provided beyond a certain scale. So it's as states got bigger, then they would provide the service as well. And this is a kind of a transactional exchange-based model. Now, if we are going to take this argument that says, okay, armies, the sort of raising of armies then creates these institutions, right? It's important to look at the empirical foundations of that case, of that claim, right? How do armies get raised? And I will sort of give you evidence from a key early example that gives us a very remarkable sort of record of this process, of how this actually proceeded, and to show what the role of judicial institutions are. Now, in 1181, the king issues, it's an assize, it's something like a statute, right, where he proclaims the royal monopoly over the use of force. In 1181, right, what you have is a statement that stipulates how many arms each subject should have based on their land holdings and possessions, right? That's a feudal system. All arms, he says, should be in the service of the Lord King of England. Jews could not own weapons. They had to sell them, if they had any, to rightful sort of subjects. And he stipulated, the king stipulated, let no one carry arms out of England except by the order of their Lord King. If that's not the monopoly of the legitimate use of force, I don't know what is. I mean, this is a very strong statement. And the key here is that the enforcement of these rules depended on the judicial system, right? So you have these justices, as they're called, who are itinerant royal officials who obtained oaths from jurors in courts who had to testify whether their neighbor really had the possessions he was claiming, on which basis his arms responsibilities were determined, right? So you got oaths in courts in order to enforce this statute. Within a century, you have Parliament as a coadjulating institution, and you have a new statute coming out that basically demanded that the justices now come into Parliament, which has become a regular institution. And that is where the commissions of array, which is like commissions given to, Knights of the Shire or other individuals to go out and raise troops, right? So this is enforced through courts and through Parliament. In order to see why I'm saying you can't really distinguish courts, which are typically state institutions, from parliaments, you want to look at this structure, which unfortunately is not very clear in the slide. I don't know if you can see it, but this is basically a representation of the medieval court system. No? Okay, the medieval English court system. The upper semicircle is basically different courts. So the reason we have the same word for court, royal court, and judicial court is not an accident, right? The royal court had different sessions, one of which was Parliament. Another one might be, the King's Bench, which covered sort of judged cases. Another one was the Exchequer, the Chancellor. These are all court sessions. And so you have this sort of basically integrated institutional structure at the center, that's a top semicircle, which is integrally related to the courts in the provinces, right? So the different royal courts, many of which were itinerant, right, in the provinces, were basically like arms of the central court, right? Arms of, branches effectively of Parliament or of the courts. They acted as local representatives. So that is why I'm saying you cannot really separate the idea of courts from parliaments. These come these come together, and they are interrelated in a way that can't be distinguished in the way our contemporary understandings claim. So the conclusions here is that raising troops depended on a pre-existing court structure, right? And this court structure was the infrastructural foundation of Parliament. And as a result, I think we can claim that the same structure that built the English regime also built what we call today the state. So the realist will ask, maybe that court structure was caused by war, sort of generated by the demands of war. And so here, let me just say, since war happened all the time, the perfect isolation is really impossible. So we can just give a number of arguments that kind of allow us to delimit more carefully exactly what the role of war was, right? So, you know, if you're going to be saying, okay, this court structure that I'm saying that was already there from the 1180s, okay, let's go further back in the past, right? The classic instance is the Norman conquest. That was war. It involved conflict. Could that be connected? In fact, the judicial system that we're talking about really only fully formed a century later. So no doubt that the Norman invasion was hugely important in shaping outcomes. You really can't make the connection and say that this court system is a result of the conquest itself. Now, another major argument that is in the literature is Blades and Pike sort of article in International Organization talking about the role of crusades, right? And the role of raising, for instance, the Saladin tithe in order to support the war in crusades. This happens in 1188, right? And small fact is that the English king was the one who didn't go on crusades, but they did raise a tax. So the question is can that really explain? Well, in fact, we know that by the 1188, the court structure that I'm talking about was basically fully formed because we have a celebrated text that gives us a lot of the information that we have on this, and that was completed by 1187 to 89. So when the Saladin tithe, when the Crusader tax was actually raised, this court structure already proceeded and enabled the raising of these funds. Next big step is the 100 Years' War, where I show with some original data collection, both of military forces and tax extraction that goes back to the 1100s. England was able to raise 3 times the amount per capita that France could already from the 1300s, right? So that's how it was able to sustain a 100-year war faced with an opponent that had 3 to 4 times its population and prevail for many decades in this battle. But in fact, Parliament was already formed by 1290, right? So you can't really use these kind of major war sort of instances. Now, of course, there's a lot more to be said on this, but the key here is that there is no argument out there that is effectively isolating the impact of war in a way that precedes this institutional structure. So the next question, but to sort of further support this point, let me just take another perspective here and another line of argument, which is that if you're saying that parliaments were convened in order to gather the resources necessary for war, then you have to be able to show that these parliamentary meetings, right, were in fact intended for taxation. You'd think that this is an elementary empirical demonstration of the point that all this bellicist literature is predicated on. And there is such data, but it hasn't really been looked at least in the social scientific, well, even in the historical literature. But if in fact you actually analyze the meetings that were held and isolate the ones that were exclusively tied to taxation, what you will see is that this line, right? The number of parliaments of English parliaments that were granting taxes were in fact a fraction. So that the gray line is the English Parliament for all its business. So they're a fraction. In fact, they're a fraction that is so low, they are close to the frequency of the French Estates General, which I think allows the conclusion that if taxation had been the only reason English parliaments were called, it would have the frequency of the French Estates General, and it would have met the same fate, which is to atrophy. right? So you can't really make that claim. Now, if you want to explain what it is that accounts for the gap between, so what is the business that explains the gap between tax granting parliaments and parliaments overall, your best indicator or your best sort of clue lies in this institution, which was, of course, the French judicial institution that had indeed a similar frequency as the English Parliament. And that's the key. In fact, the regularity of the English Parliament was the fact that it was the central judicial institution of the British monarchy up until 2005, right? Until they got a Supreme Court, the Supreme sort of judicial council, the judicial institution of the United Kingdom was the House of Lords in Parliament. So this is what gives us a regularity, because justice, as opposed to taxation and war, is regular and constant. Whereas in France and the other European cases that I examine in the book, judicial functions were separate, right? So you had the Parlement and the Estates General. And so the fiscal political institutions convened much more rarely, eventually atrophying, right? So you cannot really attribute parliaments to taxation if not, that's not the real purpose or their dominant purpose. In fact, French institutions that did have it much more, that met much more frequently in proportion for taxation, in fact, did not survive over time. So, so the claim here is that war and taxation can't explain the regularity of English courts and parliaments. And so the question is, what does explain them? And I think the historical record suggests very clearly that the cause needs to be looked for in landed relations, right? So again, England offers us, I think, the most clear-cut example. The court system that I described is really predicated on landholding. And to appreciate this, we need to be reminded of the fact that I think is known in general, but not really recognized, certainly is not in social science, that all land in medieval England, and I would argue till today, is held of the king. Canada's land is held of the king. It's a formality today, but it wasn't in the medieval period, right? So when you hear common law, it's not the kind of customary law that Hayek has told us about that springs from the bottom up, right? It was, in fact, the royal law that was held in the royal courts to adjudicate cases of land that was held from the king. That's what made it common, that it was royal. Right? So that means that justice was not granted in exchange for protection or extraction. It flowed from the land system. And this condition of landholding is not, in fact, unique to England, right? It's widespread in the pre-modern world. I find it in Russia and the Ottoman Empire. I'm really looking forward to looking at the Chinese records and looking at beyond to see a comparison there. The cases varied, I argue, according to the strength of the ruler to impose landed regime rights and obligations. And this is where the English king actually predominated, right? Because he had greater capacity to enforce those rights over the population that, over the English population. So, you might be asking yourselves, is England the exception, right? Is this just an outlier? Now, in the medieval period, I cover in my book 13 Western European cases between the 1100s and the 1600s, and I also add, for comparative purposes, Russia and the Ottoman Empire. I do have to say, and that should not work against the case, that this is not a common, the capacity of the ruler to enforce those rights is not common throughout Europe. But I will argue this is what explains, for instance, the greater difficulty that continental European powers had in actually consolidating the state, right? What you do find is a number of specific time periods or specific regions in which the kinds of mechanisms that I outline are in fact replicated. But the evidence, I think, in favor of this argument is actually very nicely confirmed by some fascinating work in the modern world from the most unlikely of places, which is rebel and criminal organizations, where scholars have shown that leaders of these groups use adjudication as a tool of control, right? So you've got Anna Horner's fascinating work on Colombia showing that rebel groups would actually one of the first things that they would do was appropriate the right to adjudicate, and where they did that, the better. That is where they had greater control over their territories. Revkin has shown that for ISIS, for criminal organizations, Grillo, Wolf. This is a burgeoning literature. It's not very big, but I think the evidence is pretty compelling. And what it suggests is that both medieval lords and modern rebel and gang leaders realize that control of justice means control of people. But this is an insight that is neglected in political science overall, certainly in the state-building literature. Now, the reason why I think we have this difficulty in appreciating the role of justice stems from the fact that the social scientific imagination has really been shaped, certainly in the post-war period, by some towering German scholars, Weber, Schumpeter, and Hinze, right? And we want to see now what kind of effect this has had in our understanding. So an interesting point that is obvious, but I don't think it's been remarked upon, is that these classics of social science were written, certainly the first two, in at times of catastrophic conditions in Germany, right? So 1919, Germany has been humiliated. 1918, there's of course, Schumpeter's Austrian, but still you've got the turnip winter where the people were starving. Hinze, slightly better conditions, but still Germany living through great turmoil and really profound sort of transformations. And I think a question needs to be posed. Why is it that social science has really based itself on the models derived by, of course, they're, as I said, towering figures, but from analyses that are aimed at explaining what arguably could be called the sort of problem child of Europe, right? So this was not a case of smooth transition to state capacity by any means. And there are many explanations that can be given. I want to focus here on some to show that I acknowledge that war does have some effects that are clear and incontrovertibly true, and I think this is what has made the paradigm so persuasive. And the key point here is that war does explain some of the key 20th century social and political developments, right? It explains the ratchet effect, right? No doubt about that. It explains a related increase in progressive taxation, as Shivan Sasovich and others have shown. The extension of suffrage, civil rights, welfare policies, as Scotchwell argued, these can be clearly attributed to the effect of war, right? 26th Amendment, if you're old enough to fight and die for your country, you're old enough to vote. Clear cut, right? The point that I will make here, however, is that in all these cases, war increased what was already there, right? So it's an extension of rights. It did not form new rights or new outcomes. And if you can think of any opposing examples, please let me know. But it seems to me that this is a very important distinction that, of course, corroborates the point that I'm saying, that war is not really what will get you state formation that might explain later developments. Now, let me just also say, in the paper, I go through some other explanations. For instance, the fact that American social science has been very much influenced by émigré scholars. There's a lot more to say about the story, but I'm just selecting this to acknowledge that war. I'm not denying any effects to war, just specifying the conditions. Now, the problem with this focus, I think, is that it has really created a kind of a dependent variable that is a little amorphous. So we need to think a little bit more clearly about what it is that we're trying to explain. Again, I go through this in greater detail in the paper. I don't have enough time to go through all the steps, but I'll give you the main points, which is that you have these literatures today, and these are indicative, not comprehensive, but we can say we have, the European state system, arguments explaining large territorial states. You've got arguments about state capacity and related arguments about state building or development. So let me just say some brief things about these. Now, if you look at this literature a bit more carefully, you will see that what these arguments are explaining, and the authors admit that, is really great power emergence, right? This is an extremely important topic, right? I'm not saying that it shouldn't be examined, but it's not the same as the emergence of a state that is effectively able to perform the functions that its citizens require. That might overlap, maybe for, states that aspire to great power status, but it doesn't necessarily. I mean, it's not clear to me why Germany or Russia should form models of state development or the past have any normative pull. Okay. Now, in terms of the state capacity literature, which is an extremely rich literature, what we will see is that the kinds of indicators that they are using are, in fact, capturing aspects of state activity without actually capturing what I argue is at least one central fundamental aspect. So capacity indicators typically chosen are military expenditures, conscription, taxation, road and rail building, censuses, education. These have transformed our understanding of how states perform. Very important research. I've got a number of citations in the paper. But I will argue in conclusion that by revisiting Weber and attempting a more qualified definition of the state, we will see that there's crucial elements of what really constitutes the state that is missing. So I can't go through these in any detail right now. We don't have the time. I consider, in order to come up with at least a first attempt at a definition, some of the major sort of concepts that are connected to the definition of the state in the existing literature. And I examine each in order to make the claim that really what matters in each is the capacity of this authority we call the state to effectively govern and ensure that the purposes of the regime are met. So it's really, again, boiling down to the juridical character of the state. And I arrive at an approximation of a definition that says, we've got to, of course, involve territory, but we also have to have an understanding of what the corresponding community is. We can't really be talking about state formation without also talking about nation formation. There's a big book by Richard Benzel that is talking about exactly this, and it's a very important topic. But we also need to understand this kind of idea of a perpetual juridical character of the state that is predicated on the laws that establish the social bonds and obligations. And really, this is something that I extract from Tilley's distinction between states and tribes, churches, right? So that's his defining distinction. Which really takes us to the point that what is distinctive to the state is this legal relationship of bonds that is not predicated on blood or, ethnic kinship, but is predicated on rules and laws. And this was actually surprising to me, not surprising to Tilley because he talks about citizenship straight away, is that this is fundamentally connected to an understanding of citizenship, which is pretty universally identified with equality. Now, I know these are strong statements here. I can't defend them in the Q&A, but this is really part of what we conceive of the modern state. And what I argue in the paper is that we can find this idea of juridical equality already from the Middle Ages in England, where you don't see a division between different social groups among the free, right? And all this is articulated through the institutions we might call bureaucratic, governing, and sometimes representative. So to conclude, any operationalization of the concept that does not involve laws, courts, juridical practices, petitions, and how the community is defined is not fully capturing the state itself, and this affects our causal explanations. So, thank you.
when I do a PowerPoint, I always like embedded videos, especially for undergraduates. And I have the perfect embedded video for you. There's a great series about police and criminals in Baltimore called The Wire. Season 2, the drug kingpin, Stringer Bell, holds a meeting of his nefarious crew. And it turns out he runs this meeting by Robert's Rules of Order. So you ought to incorporate that into your talk. Certainly shows that drug gangs or criminals are affected by the sort of things that you're highlighting. I want to ask you a question. So, and unfortunately, this involves a little bit of intellectual biography, but I was in graduate school at Chicago from 82 through 88. And one of the big issues that united a lot of the faculty at that point was the state. Okay. So Theda Skocpol was there, but there were a lot of other people. And really it was two groups who in the late 70s and 80s had come to believe that the independent role of the state had been underappreciated. The Marxists who discovered, maybe with Perry Anderson's The Lineages of the Absolute State, but with a lot of other work, that in fact it wasn't social class by itself that was a key actor, that the state and how it was defined, we could talk about, that played an independent role. And liberals as well, people like J. David Greenstone. So all of them were reacting against, I think, what you're trying to do, which is connect and maybe even conflate the state with the regime. Both of them, I think, were in fact saying you can't do that if you want to understand the role of the state, defined largely the way Skocpol defined it in the quote that you put up. So the question then, if that characterization of the sociology of knowledge in the mid-1980s is right, how are you going to respond to the realization at the time that conflating the two was in a way not helpful in understanding the role of the state? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the great question. I'll respond straight away. So, so this is, of course, the big question, right? So this is, and as I say in the paper, I don't want to resurrect the old debate between pluralists and statists, but
but also Marxists too.
And also Marxists, right? But I will say this, that there's a very important distinction between the normative and the empirical, right? So I call this the normative empirical inversion. A lot of this scholarship really is in many ways motivated by a kind of a normative commitment to the autonomy of the state from not all of it, but a lot. There is this idea that we should have a state that is autonomous, right? And there is an empirical case to be made for some instances where that is the case, but it's not clear that those cases are the ones that lead to the more effective state formation. So if you look at the literature that talks about autonomy, right, and bureaucratic autonomy, you go back to Nettel, Nordlinger, all those people. In fact, the scholarship that really emphasizes autonomy is the continental scholarship, right? And that is where state building had its most severe problems. In fact, state building, I argue, had a more sort of a smoother trajectory in, say, England, And the reason that is the case is precisely because regime and state were so interconnected that people have been left with the impression that, Nettle calls England stateless. England was not stateless. England was raising 3 times the troops and revenue, right, that France was doing. So you have a case that is actually fusing these 2 concepts and actually performing a lot better. And this is an argument that has an exact parallel in Weber's classic argument, pointing out that England, in fact, didn't have bureaucratic autonomy, right? England was a patrimonial case. You see that in Ernst as well. So this discussion about autonomy, I think, doesn't really do, and it needs to do a little bit of a more careful job separating what was in fact a normative prescription for greater autonomy, which you find a very strong theme in continental scholarship, right? Versus looking at the empirical record that suggests that, in fact, the fusion was more effective. This is the paradox of England, right? Here in the States, everybody talks about separation of powers, right? The executive and the legislative and the judicial. England had them all fused, right? But England also produced the first constitutional state and modern economy. So the idea that these have to be separated is, I argue, more of a normative argument than necessarily a prescription for how to get effective states. Now, I'm not going to argue that let's have a patrimonial state today or let's fuse everything, but we do need to take stock of the fact that the country that produced the parliament that has been the most robust, right? I mean, the English Parliament has had a continuous history from the 1200s, actually didn't separate these things and didn't have either bureaucratic autonomy or judicial separation of powers or any of these themes that are so central in the literature that you describe.
Could I just follow up really quickly, though? Because I don't see this as a normative preference. Marxists, think of Lenin's definition of the state, the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. That's not an autonomous state. The Marxist state theorists from Perry Anderson on came grudgingly to that recognition. And likewise, the pluralists and the liberals, also didn't have a vested interest in the autonomous state. That was an empirical thing that confounded their clear normative preferences. No.
So this can't be resolved. This can't be resolved because we need to look at the. But the Marxists were saying it wasn't autonomous. That was their original argument, and you're saying that they later admitted greater autonomy. Yes. But that is what I'm saying. There is that the cases that did show greater autonomy are not, that might have been empirically the case, that you can find instances in Europe where there were some state authorities that were more autonomous. Those are not necessarily the cases where more effective state building actually occurred. So there's a difference between explaining what happened in Europe, which is what this literature was involved in, versus and I had this slide which I cut off to be in time, the difference between a historical argument and a theoretical argument. So if you're making the historical argument, yes, there are instances of greater autonomy. Were those the cases with more effective state building? I'm arguing likely not, because the most effective state builder, I would argue, is England, and England didn't have such autonomy. Right? It didn't have such an autonomy to the extent that people believe that that there's no state in England. Why? Because the functions of the state, what we consider the state, are actually being carried out by the regime, right? So and that's what leads, Nettle calls both England and America stateless, right? Why? Because the state does not have a separate, autonomous, it's not even a discursive entity, but does that mean that America doesn't have state capacity? It has it at a far higher rate than, I would argue, many other countries, and so was the case with England, right? So our arguments about autonomy are, to the degree that they are empirically correct, as you're rightly objecting to me, we'd need to have a discussion. give me those examples, and let's see whether those are the most effective states. My argument is not about how states formed, is how do we form effective states. That's why I said we've got to rethink our dependent variable. If we're just explaining how many different states existed, that's a historical enterprise. Perfect respect for history. I thank 44 historians. My work wouldn't be possible without them. But if you want to do a theoretical argument about how to be effective, which is effective states, which is what all the literature on state capacity tries to do, there you need to look at the states that did have effectiveness and see, was there autonomy? I'm arguing not.
Professor, thank you so much for your talk. I have 2 questions. First, I was wondering, you said that England is an example of both a strong state and a strong regime, and France is an example of a strong regime without a strong state. Is that correct?
No, I would argue that France is not showing strength in either dimension. So at least in the early formative period, and we have to not associate strength with raising large troops like it did in the 17th century. That's a different story. But for the period of origins that I'm working on, state formation, early period, France is weak on both counts.
Okay. Could you give an example of a state that is strong on one count and weak on the other, and kind of just for me to get a better sense of the concept? So strong state, weak regime, strong regime, weak state. And the second question is, I was hoping you could point me in the right direction. Like right now, I see the inverse relationship as more of a flipped arrow than an inverse proportional relationship. And the way that I'm thinking about it is that strong institutions help a country wage war more effectively. They have more resources, they can raise more resources, and so the arrow is flipped. It should be the other way around. Whereas I think the title of the...
Sorry, so which way should be the arrow?
So it should go from the state, a stronger state allows for better waging of war. And
stronger state, yeah, that's my argument, right?
Yeah, that's kind of how I'm interpreting it.
Yeah,
but
correctly.
The title of the paper had sorry. I think that's, I'm forgetting.
Okay, let me answer the first, and when it comes back, okay, maybe I shouldn't have, so strong state, weak regime. Now, empirically, and I don't want to answer this because this is not really my period, and I haven't really studied the Prussian case carefully enough to be sure that the terms apply correctly. But if I were to choose one, it would be Prussia, with a number of qualifications. Because when people talk about strong state in the literature, they typically talk about, big armies, coercion, suppression. My definition of strength is, are you able to extract and to compel? So the key factor in my argument is power over the most powerful. So the subtitle of the book is Power, Justice, and the Origins of Parliament. So how well can you force the most powerful to do what you want, right? And that is not something that I have found to be the case in Europe in cases where the regime did not follow suit, right? So when you have rulers actually doing that, in Europe, which is a limited sample, you did find, so in Catalonia, for instance, in parts of Hungarian history, so you do find these pockets of strength, but then it's followed by strong regime. Now, if Prussia actually is a case of, strong state, weak regime because it was authoritarian, right? So that I would classify as authoritarian. That would depend on a metric that I don't have, which was how could it compel its aristocracy, right? So I can't give you a definitive answer, but certainly from the cases that I've covered, when you find strength over the aristocracy, you do find the patterns of judicial integration that I mentioned. Now, history does pose methodological problems because it doesn't give us a perfect distribution of cases, but I would argue that that is probably correct. So if you remember the other one, we can...
I think I do. I guess I interpreted your argument to be a flipped arrow, like the way I mentioned it earlier, but in one of the subtitles for the paper, it said more war, less state.
Okay, so that was the original. I've changed the title. That doesn't. Okay, so that I'm not going to defend that title yet. So I'm going to defend this one. So that would take us into because there's a bit of a problem in the way that we use the terms. So when you say weak regime, what do you mean by weak regime? I mean by weak regime not having these representative structures. This is a very normative description. Weak regime can be defined in different ways, right? So I'll hold off on that. And when I finish that other paper, we could hopefully have a discussion. So who's next?
Yes, thank you. This was a fascinating presentation, and I quite enjoyed the paper as well. So my main question is let's say you're right, and let's say you've convinced all of us that...
Let's say. Now that you've done it, no. I thought one paper would do the trick, no.
No, but let's say you're right, and let's say that people buy the argument that the way we've approached state formation has been misguided over the last century, going back to our readings of Faber and so on. Well, what does the new study of state formation, or what does the new study of states look like in a Boucoyannis world? Like,
well, I mean, thank you. So it's what I do in the book, right? You look at how people. So if you're going to be explaining parliaments, which is what I do in the book, right? What are parliaments? Effectively, parliaments are institutions that aggregate petitions. And this is not just in England. You find it in Castile, in Catalonia, in Hungary, even in Russia, right? And the Ottoman Empire, right? So people petition the Sultan just as they petition the Tsar. This is pretty universal. And I think it's, I know it's even in the Asian world. I just don't know how pervasive it was. So what you want to be doing is to be looking at how these patterns of petitioning, right, get aggregated. Because in effect, if you look at it this way, if Parliament is simply aggregating petitions, which then, once they are communal petitions, they're general, then they result in legislation, right? That's basically modern representative government. I'm not being anachronistic here. You have that already from the early 1400s, 1300s in England. So then you want to be looking at these patterns of aggregating petitions, that's truly popular politics, right? Petitions are about the things that matter the most for subjects, right? There's already fascinating work. Edgar Franco Vivanco has published in World Politics, looking at colonial Latin America and looking at the role of petitions in structuring state-society relations. My argument is that the big sort of divide between Western constitutionalism and Oriental despotism is in fact nothing of the sort. The main difference of England in particular was its capacity to take all these petitions, right, from around the territory, aggregate them in the center through this court system that I've described. And once they were in the center and they collectively organized, then they could present these collective demands, which resulted in legislation, right? And that's what we call representative government. I'm simplifying, but not too much. So then the difference between Western constitutionalism in its most advanced form and Russia is not, the West had rights and the Russians just like despotism and the Tsar, is that in Russia, this process of centralized institutionalization of petitions didn't happen because the Tsars did not have the power. Right? There were people who were demanding to go to the center. The central authorities tried to do that. I go through that in the section, but they didn't manage to coalesce. And so the assemblies that actually held, even in Russia, we have from the 1500s and the 1600s, we have sort of assemblies that even elect tsars, right? But these never consolidated to define the regime. Right? So you look at the difference between, Western constitutional government and non-Western forms, not as we have rights and they don't, but how do these societies structure the basic form of petitioning, right, in different ways, depending on state strength, right? How does state strength allow this centralization? Now, again, this is pending a comparison with China. I say that in the book. This argument is not final. In my book, I simply identify some necessary conditions. I think without having a comparison with China, Japan, other non-Western cases, you're not going to have, the full gamut of cases to conclude. But I think that is a necessary part of the argument, I would argue. Is that?
Yeah,
So-
I get it. This is more separate. I guess this answers all of it. I guess I was thinking about, for example, people studying African politics today, where they're thinking about, why is Africa still poor? Like, why aren't African states able to, govern the population effectively? And they'd say something that it's a shorting of state capacity. They can't control violence, and so they don't have the ability to.
For that, my argument also has an implication, and in fact, it's been tested by. He was my student when he tested it, but he had been my student in the past. So Weigel, who's done research in the Congo, and he actually did an experiment and tested a central implication of my argument as far as taxation, which is that, our Western model is that, rulers are weak and they grant rights when they're weak and they need to extract resources. In fact, my argument is you only get parliament when the ruler is strong, and he can force everyone to come to power. Representation was an obligation in the medieval period. It wasn't a right. So if that's true, in the instances where you have greater capacity to enforce taxation, that's where you're going to see greater engagement and participation in politics and potentially greater, more positive outcomes. And he tested that in an experiment, right? He actually conducted an experiment when one section were actually, people were left to pay taxation on their own, and the other you had government officials going and knocking on the door. Where they knocked on the door, they had greater participation. So it does have, but it switches the current, because the current argument is, well, you need a weak state, you shouldn't intervene, certain taxation is inhibiting. In my argument, taxation is what forges the kind of civic conception. So that would be the implication. Hasn't been adopted yet, but except for the experiment, but yeah.
So I teach the state, and there's we actually basically discusses, legislation, toleration, and states capacity. So I'm a little surprised that, there's this.
Yeah, this is a bit louder, yeah.
There's a presumption that, people get these two concepts mixed up. I don't think that most people get these two concepts mixed up. And then it's just, in a way, that's certainly not totally. For example, he argues that this a big paradox is a big surprise, is a byproduct that is militarization would lead to civilization in Europe. And then also in his work on contentious politics, he also makes a very big distinction between the regime of the situation and also the state's capacity of situation, which for pretext in the foreign opportunity structure. So, in a way, then I'm not entirely sure if that, if it is still correct to say that people don't really understand what state formation is.
No, but that's, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So then it's really the question is, I like that you address the question if England is really, if it's a special case. You show us that these other cases that you also looked at, but they also related to, essentially they would be in kind of the same kind of region. Say that whatever England was doing could be a model for these other countries nearby. And then at the same time, then we jump to gangster organizations. So I'm not sure.
So what's the connection to the gangster? How does that work?
Yeah, you said that, beyond essentially the argument. I think if you want to make the arguments, the England is not unique.
That England is not unique.
Yeah, that's what I took what you argued. England is not unique because there is other European countries. But then at the same time, you also said that continental Europe is also not like England in the sense that the estates departments, basically were much weaker and they didn't really regularly all of that. And then another way that you try to address the question, if England is unique, you then turn to rebel groups and gangster groups. So I'm just wondering if, you talk about the other cases around the world, but if the focus is on the metering out of justice, we do see that was the key aspect that we saw in China. In fact, that because there was no parliament. So it was part of the bureaucracy. It was part of state's capacity, and therefore state's capacity and regime can merge into one is because essentially there's no surprise in monetarization leading to the unintended outcome of secondary relaxation when state's capacity is really strong.
Okay, so I'd love to talk to you more about the Chinese court system, and that's, as I said, the major next step. But let me just clarify a thing. I'm not saying that the literature confuses. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that people, scholars generally, keep them distinct, right? And in fact, Louis Cannon is making a strong argument. We need to, so we've had a discussion on this. And I totally accept that, we need to be clear about when there are differences between these two. So I'm not saying that Tilly is, I'm saying exactly the opposite. In the literature, they're separate, right? And in fact, the demands that we consider them as separate. All I'm saying is that empirically, if you go back to the Middle Ages, you will see that courts that you're saying are part of the state. I'm saying you can't really distinguish them from regime, right? Because courts are really central to the functioning of parliament. They're like extensions, they're arms of the parliament in effect, right? And they're part of the same system of land control. So you can't really make that distinction. So is that right? So are we clear on that?
Yeah, so then the question is, if that arrangement is so unique, and if England is unique.
But I haven't said that England's unique. I've never used that term. I hope I didn't. But what I've said is that this system of landholding, for instance, is prevalent throughout the pre-modern period. In fact, including, I would argue, in the East. What I am saying is different in England is the capacity of the ruler to enforce his rights, right? If it does have an exceptional capacity in that respect, does it make it unique? I started off, as I say in the preface of my book, wanting to defeat English exceptionalism. I really didn't appreciate this argument that the English just had these conceptions of rights and nobody else had it. And it's like, where do these rights come from? My book is an effort to explain where they come from and to explain the specific conditions, right? Ultimately, how that power, greater capacity of the English king, that's one of my next projects. Nobody, I think, has answered that. But where England differs, right, is in this greater capacity. And I know in social science there's a kind of a resistance to saying that there's, this exception because we can't generalize. But the fact of the matter remains, and that is conceded even by continental historians who don't like this argument, in the continent you don't find parliaments that actually succeeded in taking petitions from the provinces, turning them into collective petitions, legislating. So by the early 1400s, Parliament was actually proposing, the Commons were proposing solutions to these. They were legislating, right? And this then applied as law to the land. Now, if you have this instant, okay, so maybe it's one. We still have to explain it. And, we should not allow that sort of resistance to what is a rare outcome to lead us against studying the conditions, which is exactly what's happened, because social science has ignored England. Like, you have all these quantitative studies. England is lost as one observation among hundreds. Even in the qualitative literature, there's really a kind of resistance in saying, okay, what is the effect of state? So even the classics of historical institutionalism, the effort is to explain the variation, right? I think that is a historical enterprise that's extremely important. Right? What I'm trying to do here is to say, well, we also need an argument about what builds effective states in a manner that conforms to our expectations about what a state should be doing. And if England was managing to do that from the medieval period, at least certain key elements, we should have an account for that, right? So it is true that it had monopoly of the legitimate use of force from 1181, as I showed. It also had juridical equality. You mentioned that, great, I love that stuff about the king having sort of juridical equality. The English did much later. As I argue in the piece, the fact that this juridical equality was tied to the system of courts that was predicated on land, gave it a longevity that allowed the institutions to survive. So I think that's not the full explanation for the variation with China, but I think it's a necessary component of it.
So then, essentially, it sounds like England is unique, So
It's-
so that because
Okay.
continental Europe just basically nowhere near that, and certainly that is not. The
That
case
is that a
in other
problem?
places. Because it sounds like you want to make a general argument. This is what
So,
I'm asking.
but it's not. I mean, but that's what I'm saying. If it is, can we come up with other cases where you have a parliament that manages to do all this? I mean, there's variation. It kind of falls down in the period, the Stuarts, etc. But they certainly were doing this early on, right? And they certainly had the capacity to raise per capita. Even in the time of Adam Smith, England was raising, probably twice as much per capita as the French. Okay, so if you have a state that is doing some things well, okay, so maybe it's one. Are we not going to study it? Are we not going to learn? I think we should, and I think, privileging the experience of continental Europe is not helping, that was my argument there, it's not helping developing states to build effective models to the degree that they want to follow the Western.
Right, I made the same arguments too, but then I'm just saying that because it sounds like you want to make a generalizable argument. So it does seem like it is that England is very, very special case.
So basically you're saying that we can't have a generalizable argument if we establish sort of mechanisms. Well, but here is all my process tracing across my 13 cases of European history, right? I've done a lot of work to show exactly that. I go through hundreds of years, in fact, in total. Hungary, I mean, you saw the states, sort of Catalonia, Castile, France, in order to show that we might not find a perfect example of this, but we find, for instance, the Polish Sejm, the Polish parliament, asking the king to carry out justice, which was exactly the thing that I'm saying England did exceptionally well from an early period. So you have the Polish representatives asking the king to do that, and he basically didn't have the capacity to do it. So it's not as if this is something that is unique to England. Across Europe, polities were trying to do similar things. In some cases and in some periods, some rulers had greater capacity to do it. There you get representation. In cases where the ruler didn't have that capacity, you didn't. So it's not extrapolated from one instance. I try to provide a lot of supplementary evidence, but then even if it's just one, again, are we going to ignore it? So we can go and test, do experiments, see does the logic work, and maybe come up with, at least we should not ignore it like the discipline is doing and treating it as an outlier. It is the mother of all parliaments and the country that generated Western constitutionalism and liberal market economy, and it's been, especially for this country, a model. So.
Next up is Dan Lindley.
Thank you very much for...
Could I just interrupt? If when I started graduate school, if I heard somebody saying the things that I'm saying now, I probably would have been very mad. But, it's the result of a lot of study. So that's where study led me to.
Yeah, thank you very much for one of those rare talks that can actually change the way you think. So I appreciate that.
That's the best compliment. Thank you.
My first question or issue is wondering about the other things, not necessarily the primary things, but other things that form part of the contract with citizens that states have to provide when they're being formed. So emergency food, emergency firewood, protection for travelers, whatever it might be. What are some of the other ingredients that states feel demanded from people to have a social contract, and how has that demand changed over time? It's hard to think of a state being established now, or in the formation of the principalities in Germany or whatever, states being formed without providing an education system or infrastructure of various sorts. So what are those other things that states can provide, and how have they changed over time? And the second thing I want to know is juridical procedures can serve a variety of purposes, and I'm wondering what the purposes were that you're referring to. One would be, property disputes. I think you mentioned that kind of thing. The other thing judicial procedures are very good for is to put a fig leaf on repression. And I would think that would be a pretty important thing for state formation too. So if you could talk about those things that I raised. Thank you so much.
So, well, thank you for, that's the best compliment that anyone can hope for. So thank you very much. So in terms of, let me start backwards, repression. One of the key points that I have is that, in fact, one area in which the English state sort of excelled in was precisely its capacity to compel and coerce, right? So violence is and compulsion is a central ingredient, unfortunately, right, if we're talking about the empirics, of getting this institutional business started. So as you saw, the English king basically regulated whether people could take arms out of the country from 1181. I mean, I'm not sure there was perfect enforcement, just as there isn't today in America, right? But certainly, just the fact that he articulated that goal, I'd be interested to see. I'm sure in China there were similar regulations. I'm not sure how they were enforced. So this is a central part of the story. The fact that I'm saying that war is not causing things should not be confused with an argument that violence is not and coercion. They are a central part of the story, right? I mean, the Norman invasion, William the Conqueror walks in or invades, and he basically decapitates the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, right? Physically and also. So repression, I don't know if that answers what you were asking, but it's certainly huge. Does that answer the...
I just want to get the flavor for the juridical purposes.
So the point is, however, that how the juridical connects to that. Well, the key here is that coercion, violence, abuses are going to be happening in all these political entities, right? What allows these practices to, in the end, aggregate into institutions that survive and become states that we can study and talk about is precisely whether there is this kind of juridical basis. So just to give you an example, so I talked about, using justices to recruit, to basically conscript people, right? And to make them serve. In Ukraine today, as we've seen tragically, the state has to go around and beat people up in order to get them to serve, right? You can do that too, but the fact that this conscription is happening through violent means rather than jurors coming and testifying that you have so much land, so you've got to produce so many lances, is critical to whether you get a state or whether you get state deformation, in the two cases, right? So whether these violent practices happen within a juridical framework shapes the later path. Okay, does that? And then you had, sorry, remind me your first.
The things that states provide when they're formed.
So, okay, so that is.
Purposes have changed over time.
So that is a very, okay, I cannot. It's a very complex question, and I can't really tell you how they have changed over time because I haven't studied the provision of social services over time. It's a very, very complex topic. The one thing that I will say is that it is absolutely remarkable the extent to which medieval rulers conscripted subjects to actually perform works. And again, I'm sure in China it's the same thing. So in England, the subjects had to build the king's roads, repair his bridges, build his boats, take care of the forest, his wine. I have a list in the book. It's just all these aspects of what we would call today state bureaucracy, in the English case, are carried out by subjects as obligations because they're holding land, which is exactly my point that I was saying before, that things that we assume to be part of the state, right? So, building bridges, fixing roads, opening canals, turnpike. That originally in the medieval period was the duty of a subject because he held land of the king. Right? So this kind of changes over time. Of course, it doesn't remain, there's no, education was provided locally, that changes over time. But certainly what we need to understand is that when we're looking at the state and looking at these modern ideas, okay, the state is performing all these functions, a ton of those functions were performed by people because of the regular citizenship duties. So it doesn't answer your question, but at least it gives you the kind of basis of to look at it, I hope.
Hi, thanks for coming. I am way out of my depth in asking you a question, so
Still
let's
welcome.
just start with that.
Those are usually the hardest questions too.
I don't know about that, but so I guess I'll just ask this it's one question in maybe two forms, but if you read, say, Mansur Olson, who you cite in the paper, right, this roving versus stationary bandit argument that under competitive pressures, or just because they want resources, rulers need to find a way they prefer to be a stationary bandit. They're going to tax, they're going to take from their people, but they actually have two interests, right? They have an interest in being able to tax a bunch, but they also have an interest in expanding the tax base. And so you make a lot of claims based on the fact that Parliament didn't always consider taxation. But if you have sort of a simple Mansur Olson view of the world, even in the sort of Bellicist frame, there are actually two things you would want to do. You would want to consider the rate of taxation, but you would also want to do something that Dan mentioned, which is you'd want to create a reliable system of property law, or you'd want to create business law, or you'd want to have judicial functions that enable growth of the tax base, right? You wouldn't just consider tax rates all the time. You would consider a whole bunch of other things that generate revenue for the state if you have that other framework. So I wonder, now, if what Parliament was doing all the time was considering non-business related petitions, like the definition of murder is the difference between manslaughter and first-degree murder or whatever, that has nothing to do with generating revenue for the state, right? If most of what Parliament was considering other than taxes is murder, I think that helps your case. But if a lot of what Parliament was considering other than taxation is still commercial, then that weakens your case that Parliament was doing a bunch of other namby-pamby stuff that didn't have to do with generating power, right?
Because it was still raising revenue.
Because they're still raising revenue. They're still doing stuff that creates the structure to raise revenue for the government. Now, another inflection of this argument, I think, or of this question, is that you also make a lot out of the power, the fact that Britain had a parliament, not a separation of powers system. And so there's unified executive, legislature, and judiciary. And clearly, compared to the United States and separation of powers system, the parliamentary system is more unified, more absolutist, more centralized, more stupid in my frame, but whatever. That's just, but it's also true that people have for a long time, a bunch of famous historians have argued that despite having a parliament and this centralized system, Britain had more limited government, or the Dutch Republic has more limited government effectively because of the common law or something else like that, right? So they have a check on the system which now allows more commercial freedom, more growth, therefore more power for a given set of tax rates. And so like I'm thinking of Peter Padfield's work as a historian on why the Dutch Republic was so successful militarily. And, it's this kind of very idealized vision of limited government. And then it translates, these are, late to the party, famous political scientist Barry Weingast realized this, stole the argument, formalized it a little bit. But, there's this whole argument about limited government, which seems, again, it's sort of the opposite of your story, but I'm wondering how you can sort of maintain. You're sort of arguing that because Britain had unification of legislature and executive, that therefore Britain is more absolutist than Napoleonic France, to put it in a recent thing, which is not what you're writing about. Like the French state at your time was weak. Okay, I get it. But there are later times, like Britain didn't have a great secret police. Britain didn't behead as many people. Even though Bloody Mary she's nasty or whatever. It just seems like you're missing a big part of the story of limited government or of non-taxation issues and how that works in limited government.
Now, I can't imagine what the question would be if this was in your depth. I said that these questions are, so excellent question. So let me just say, let me start with the second part. There's no separation of powers, yet more limited government. big theme in my book. It's what I call the normative empirical inversion, right? So, and that's a pattern that I find case after case after case, where what we end up with, limited government, we tend to think that it's caused by the same conditions at the beginning. So people see and know that England had this limited government that you're very correctly identifying, and then they go back in the past and say, oh, well, there's a balance of power between kings and nobility. But in fact, the origins of the ultimate sort of limited government are in fact in exactly the inverse empirical conditions. So it is where you have greater strength of the king to mobilize and compel all the nobility to come to the center, that the nobility solves its collective action problem and then is able to take hold of parliament and create the limited government. And I show that through historical analysis. And this works in reverse. It's in the cases where, so we see absolutist France. If you go back to the beginning, the French had far stronger rights at the individual level than the English subjects did. They paid less taxes, they had greater communal self-organization. In fact, there's exactly the reverse relationship. So I call that's a big theme. People tell me I should write an article about it. It's kind of empirical, normative empirical inversion, I call it. So that's how I explain that. You should read the book to see if it satisfies your. That's exactly. It's kind of like the starting point of the book. Now. What was this rest? The rest of the business of Parliament, if it was commercial, then they're still raising more revenue. If you want to take a functionalist perspective, it's kind of, it's very difficult to completely dissuade you. But let me just say the following. First of all, there wasn't sort of disquisitions on property. It was like, he stole my cow, right? Or, there's these land rights. This was all about land rights. So there's definitely an economic aspect of it. It's not clear that actually translated into greater revenue apart from the fees that were collected, right? And the key here is that you can say that, the kings developed this really remarkable judicial structure throughout the 39 countries, 37, right, in order to be able to raise the revenue or fight wars. But the reality was that there's a primary condition, which is all these people owned land from the king. If they had a dispute with their neighbor, or a dispute on inheritance, or a dispute on tenancy, the only ultimate judge was the king. Right? And this is a fundamental feature of pre-modern government. You find it, as I said, in Russia and the Ottoman Empire. This is kind of a basic given. Now, do the rulers then exploit this to raise more revenue, to fight more wars? Of course they did. But that's not enough, because all the medieval rulers had the same incentives, yet there's the one, right? And the key here is precisely when they channel it through the judicial structure that it results into state.
But I think the claim is that when the British and the Dutch did this, they figured out to do it via kind of a systematic set of rules as opposed to semi-arbitrary, patrimonial, absolutist, however you want to phrase it, things that shifted and didn't allow investment in commercial relationships to develop. Like the claimed advantage for the limited government republics is that confronted by "he stole my cow," they came up with a generalized way and a standardized way and a rule of law system for adjudicating how to settle the "he stole my cow" case, which didn't happen in other regimes.
Well, the difference between where it happened or it didn't happen is not that they developed, the king developed. This was the king's law. Right? It was the king's law, and the problem in France was that there was no single king's law. You had all these jurisdictions, also in Castile and the latifundia, where the nobility had greater jurisdictional autonomy. The king's writ did not run, and these rules that became, sort of generalized. And the Dutch, I have a special treatment of Holland that you can, and if you read Dutch economic historians, they point to exactly the capacity of the Dutch, the Count of Holland, who gets neglected in most accounts, but very important in the medieval period, in creating a public system of justice and preventing the nobility from dominating the local courts. Right? So that's why you have public notaries in Holland already from, the 1400. You have to read my book. I don't remember exactly the dates, but from very early on.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get a firmer grasp of your argument, because you emphasize you're telling an origin story, and you also emphasize that you're it matters to you how effective states are. So putting those two together, are you saying that states are destined to be more or less effective at their originating moment, and war comes later, and that's kind of your beef with this literature on war?
I think that's a great way of describing it, because ultimately what distinguishes England is that from the get-go, right, already from the Norman conquest, there is a greater capacity to achieve what I call the power over the most powerful, right? We see that with the Norman conquest. We see that in the later century. This is something that the French king, he was met by the Dukes of Burgundy, of Brittany. These were sometimes rulers lords that had greater military power than the French king himself. So how you start off then shapes whether you can actually raise troops in a way that builds the state in a way that is sustainable and effective.
And drinking the realist Kool-Aid here, wouldn't you say that's about power? That's about how much power the king has versus...
So it's about power, and that's, I think, the black box of social science. Where does that power of the English kings actually originate? What is it that gave them the superior capacity to force all those? So the French king would ask the nobility to come to the parliament and hear petitions just like their English neighbors did, and he couldn't. They would just not sit. They would not appear, right? The English ones, not perfectly, but at a far greater rate. Why that happened is a very complex, I touch on it on the book, but I can't tell you that I've solved it. But then in my defense, nobody has, so yeah.
Okay, it would be unjust of us to go over time, so please join me and thank
Is there somebody I could ask them personally too. If somebody has a question, I could talk to them after class, after the talk now.
I'm already on top of it.
No
Please
class,
join me
okay.
in thanking Deborah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.